Hello. Uh, my name is Tom Pal Davis, and I'm the managing editor of Oceania. And on behalf of the journal's editorial committee, I'm very happy to welcome you to the Oceania seminar. This seminar is a new initiative of the journal, which aims to offer a new venue for Pacific-focused discussion, working papers, things like that. And we hope to hold three seminars a year around the time that new issues of Oceania are published. And today we are very happy to be launching a recent special issue edited by Alex Golub and Courtney Handman entitled Rethinking Decolonisation in Papua New Guinea. And the issue examines how people have and continue to imagine decolonisation in PNG, exploring forms of political innovation in which the goal is not simply the creation of a nation state. The issue contains an eclectic range of ethnographic and historical papers by Courtney Handman, Geoffrey Gray, Ming-Jen Wu, and Alex Golub, as well as an afterword by Keir Martin. And we're very happy today to be joined by Alex Golub, who, parallel to his work on digital culture, will be well known to many of us for his masterful ethnography, Leviathans at the Gold Mine, creating Indigenous and corporate actors in Papua New Guinea. So Alex is going to give us an overview of the special issue and share some of its key arguments. And the format today will be that Alex will speak for about 20 minutes, which will be followed by an open Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question at the end, just indicate this in the chat box and I'll throw to you in the order that people have put their names down. And we're also going to be recording today for those unable to join us due to awkward time zones. So without further ado, I will pass over to Alex.
Okay, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here and be able to present. It's very rare that I have a chance to get to Australia or anywhere that's not Hawaii because I'm located in the Pacific. So it's a pleasure to see some old friends here today, as well as some new people who I look forward to meeting and getting to know a little bit better. So hello, everyone. It's good to see you. How did this Rethinking Decolonisation special issue come about? It came about despite COVID. I think the first thing to say is that this was really a project that began through COVID. COVID tried to kill it, and we refused, and we kept on moving through, and we're successful. And it's so great that it's found a home in Oceania. I think some people might have been at the Vancouver American Anthropological Association meeting that happened just before COVID. For that meeting, Courtney Handman and I wanted to put together a panel just sort of thinking about people's perceptions of independence and dependency in Papua New Guinea. Courtney and I go back a long way. We were both schoolmates as undergraduates. And in the course of doing that panel and then transitioning into the special issue, we had some people join, other people leave, but the themes that we were talking about sort of kept on developing, and they were spurred on by a couple of things. But maybe just to get it on the table first. So the theme of rethinking decolonization in the special issue is an attempt to understand what decolonization or independence, the process of becoming independent, is in Papua New Guinea. And we are not interested necessarily in thinking about what happened from 1965 to 1985, sort of the independence period, although that was one topic. What we were interested in thinking about was how people imagined the transition to independence and decolonization would be. And that could be people imagining that as a political project that they were undertaken. I'm gesturing with my hands, but you can't see. There you go. Gesturing with their hands. Right. Okay, just cut that out. That included things like what were the actions that people were undertaken and what kind of explicit and reflexive political projects were they pursuing in the independence period. But we were also thinking about how did people imagine independence would happen before it happened? And then what did they think had happened after it happened? And then how did they understand their current lives, whether prior to independence or after, with regard to this independence or this decolonization process, which was either going to occur or had occurred. So it is, as we say in the business, there was some proleptic and metaleptic work, people imagining forward and imagining back, and then imagining decolonization in the course of pursuing whatever projects it was that they were pursuing. Yeah. So that's the basic idea of it. And we wanted to explore this because we felt like we were working at an intersection of a couple of new themes. You know, first we thought that we had more history than we did have back when Courtney and I were both in graduate school in the 90s. We had the work of excellent historians such as Helen Gardner, who is here today, as well as many other people, which sort of added additional information to the kind of narratives about the colonial period that I had heard of when I was in training. When I was studying Papua New Guinea in the 90s, you know, Time Below Masta by Hank Nelson was sort of the definitive history. There was Gavin Suter's book about New Guinea. Someone can throw it in the chat what it was called, The Unexplored Land or something. That was considered, there you go, Helen, help me out there. That was considered sort of the cutting edge ethnography, you know, or sort of a good piece of background material. So we were still sort of working with a lot of history by professional historians, to be sure, but people who had been very involved in the Australian colonial project. I wouldn't say they were highly ideological, but they all had a particular point of view. They all were committed to a kind of narrative about the benevolent Australian rule, which of course is a narrative that has a lot of truth to it. Since then, though, we had had a lot of access to other kinds of stories, including thanks to the internet and New Guinea, the Last Unknown. Thank you, Helen. That's what it was. Yeah, that's right. Or, you know, Adam in Plumes and Adam in Ochre, Adam with Arrows, the Colin Simpson travel books. I was told those were the most, you know, up-to-date books about what was going on in PNG. You could find them in libraries everywhere, you know. So we didn't have Google. But once we had the internet, and we had the international book market, we could start reading stuff from the 60s and 70s, the Melanesian seminars. We could read autobiographies increasingly that were available. And there was an increasing number of people who were sort of more politically left and sort of saying, wait a second, maybe things are more complicated than this. For me personally, reading Tori Stead's book about landowner claims in Madang, on the north coast of Madang, was sort of a wake-up call for me because, you know, she took very, very seriously these landowners had a right to this land and their point of view should be taken seriously, whereas a lot of my own field work I encountered people saying like, oh, this is just, you know, what do they want, 100 million billion kina? And Tori would say, well, why not? I mean, maybe that's a reasonable thing to ask. So there was I think a swing in the discipline that way. So those are two things. First, there's more history. Second, there's a certain swing in the discipline to be more favorable, such as Tori Stead's, more favorable to these complicated, more leftist approaches that were more willing to complicate and trouble these narratives. But third, you know, there's a ton of political discourse in PNG that if you read the literature on cultural nationalism in PNG from the 1980s, Nation Making by Bob Foster, sort of new Melanesian ethnography, people talked all the time in that literature, as they did in my field site and many of other people's field sites, I'm sure, about how PNG was a failed state. They wanted the Australians back. Maybe the Japanese should have taken over. There was a discourse of abjection, as Ira Bashkow calls it. And so this seemed to be a question that was very live in PNG when we were there. You know, what was independence? Why wasn't it successful? So that was really we want this very much, I don't know if it shows up because it's, specialist academic work, but it's really informed by the concerns that we experienced, spending time in Papua New Guinea. And then finally, of course, in the wake of BLM and just a whole new era of, I guess, millennial and Gen Z maybe academics. I'm a little unclear on the generational divide there. Whole new discourse of rethinking colonialism that's returning to and was influenced by, earlier thinkers. We rely on Getachew, who's interested in Du Bois and others, but just a whole new rethinking of decolonization and a re-legitimation of sort of older leftist approaches to imperialism, and a recognition that PNG was tied up as part of that. We always knew that there are people from the Caribbean and East Africa showing up in the Waigani seminars. We always knew that PNG's independence was connected to sort of the broader Anglo-empirical kind of situation, and that these ideas were moving around all over. They were reading Senghor and West African people as well, but we never really put that together. So there's a bunch of people doing that. We didn't do that at all, and unfortunately in our work, but we were sort of inspired by that. That provided the overarching viewpoint that we have in this volume, where we're constantly asking, what is the vision that people have for PNG? Is it one of becoming a nation state where people are achieving independence, or are they recognizing, on the other hand, that formal independence is just a novel form of subordination? These are at a very high level the two options that people were thinking about in the 20th century and the late 19th century. So with that in mind and those kinds of backgrounds for our work, let me just tell you briefly about the papers. I'm sure as soon as Tom asks me a question, I'll be reminded that there's some incredibly obvious thing that I forgot to mention about that introduction. So we talk about some of these things in the introduction to the special issue, Courtney and I. And we have some papers. I'm very happy with how these came out. One of my students, Wu Ming-Jen, wrote about Papua Basena, and it's sort of, and the persistence of Papua Basena and Papuan separatism. And he has a very nice sort of thing that he does in the paper. There is some literature in the study of PNG that says, why were people in Papua and Port Moresby the most dissatisfied and the most interested in separatism when they were so, exposed to Australians? The underlying presumption there being that Papua New Guineans enjoy being ruled by Australians and benefit from it tremendously. So, which, it turns out that there were some downsides to that, including persistent humiliation, which, I mean, it's not like we didn't know that this was happening, but Ming-Jen really asks us, what if we really center that and then make that a way to understand Papua Basena? Some of these earlier scholarly concerns about they have more people in high school, so then why are they unhappy with their level of development? Sort of dissolve as we understand more clearly that oftentimes it's those people who are in a position to recognize the way in which they've been subjects of empire. Think here of Fanon or anyone else, who's been through this colonial system. And then Ming-Jen also does a good job of showing how people then internalize, in the case of Papua Basena, some of the opinions that Australians have of other ethnic groups like Highlanders, and the Papuans imagine themselves in this case to be the kind of people who could help civilize and develop Highlanders. There's an interesting colonial sort of mimesis going on, an internal segregation of PNG into higher and lower strata of civilized people, et cetera, et cetera. Many of us here will be full of that. So I think that paper does a very good job of doing that. And because that is a version of a dissertation that I supervised, I could describe it in detail. These other papers that I have read long ago, let me see if I can remember their contents. We have a lovely article by Courtney Handman, which examines the relationship between the Australian administration and the United Nations, and how the Australians related to the United Nations, and especially visits of representatives holding Australia accountable for being a trustee who is hoping to develop Papua New Guinea. And Courtney does a very good job in this paper, I think, of showing the antinomies, or the paradoxes of Australian colonial rule, where the Australians are constantly emphasizing to the UN that Papua New Guineans are not developed yet, but that the Australians are really trying. And then the trustees keep on asking, well, what happened since the last time we visited? So there's a certain kind of way in which the trustee council shed a light on the administration's sort of relative lack of interest in doing things like building, colleges or high schools, combined with its very strong claim that it was interested in doing so. So she uses that paper as a way to sort of poke a little bit at the claims of the Australian administration. Yeah. What was going to be decolonization in that case? This is the topic that is at play when you have people coming to visit PNG from the UN. Geoff Gray has a very nice, very detailed history coming out of his work in the history of anthropology. He's very prolific and always very detailed, where he sort of shows how anthropologists and others who were active in World War II imagined what independence would look like in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And he tries to show how much that was a moral question for Australian academics, and many of whom were involved with policy in the immediate post-war period. So contrary to what you might expect from a viewpoint that sees Australian administration as purely exploitative, or its claims to try to better Papua New Guineans as merely ideological, he shows that these people's experience of the debt that they owed Papua New Guineans during the war had a lot to do with how it was that they imagined decolonization. I think my son just arrived home from school and is locked in the door, so if you'll just give me 2 seconds, I'm going to let him in. There you go. You in? All right, I'm on a Zoom call. Oh, sorry. There we go. Thank you. All right. My paper is one of 2 papers on the history of law and order in Enga province that I wrote in response to the terrible growth of violence in Enga. And because this was a COVID experience, this edited volume, I couldn't really do any field work, although I knew many people were suffering terribly, so I did a lot of historical work. So this paper attempts to put the Australian administration in a comparative perspective to see what it was like. In a previous paper, I had demonstrated, I think, that the typical narrative about law and order in the Highlands was not quite right. The typical narrative is the Australians pacified everybody, then independence occurred, the country backslid, and then there was tribal fighting. But if you look at the dates in Enga, it seems that something else was happening. The Australians arrived in Enga and said, you guys should stop fighting. We're here to give you development. Engans said, that's wonderful. We hate fighting and we love cargo. And then they stopped fighting. And then after about 10 years, they realized they were not going to get all of the development which they imagined, which was a very high level of development. And also not even the level that the Australians sort of kept on promising. And fighting began again. So you see that fighting was growing in the process of the Australian administration leaving. It's something that began prior to formal independence. Yeah. So in the paper in this volume, I talk about how the Australian administration, in some sense, left Papua New Guinea in an in-between situation. They didn't want to impose Australian values onto Papua New Guineans in Enga because they thought that was highly colonial, to their credit. But at the same time, they never really, at the same time, refusing to do that set Enga off on a very different path from most other places that had been sort of colonized by a central power, like, for instance, modern European states. Typically, according to the political scientists who I studied in my attempt to study all of the history of colonialism for this paper, typically what happens is, there is a dynamic relationship between the rule and the ruler, where the ruler tries to exploit people. People develop a sense of common identity. They develop a class interest and push back against the ruler, and that colonial experience often prepares people to have a solidary new nation. And in Enga, the good news is they were sort of never colonized and had their culture and people destroyed. But the bad news was they also weren't really left with the kind of ruler-ruled dynamic that often in some places helped create a civil society that was ready to assume independence. That's the short version of the paper. Yeah. So we have all of those papers. We also have wonderful afterwords from Keir Martin, who managed to sort of sneak in a whole separate article into his afterwords. Which is fine because Keir's work is very good. I forgot to mention Keir. There's a whole bunch of other influences that I didn't mention in this high-level overview, but Keir Martin did 2 special issues on equality, where he's trying to bring history of working-class Britain and Papua New Guinea into discussion. Combining E.P. Thompson and Marilyn Strathern. If you ever were curious about what that looked like, that's what those 2 special issues were. And they're very, very interesting and stimulating. So I was delighted to have him be, I think, a peer reviewer, is that right? And then also managed to sneak in his own 2 cents, or maybe $2 since you don't have cents in Australia, into the special issue as well. So I think that's an overview. And I'm sure there's many things I forgot to say, but Tom, maybe when you or others ask questions, I'll be able to be reminded.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing this sort of the contours of the special issue. So we'll just open it up now for a Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, just pop your name down in the chat. If for whatever reason your microphone isn't working, feel free to write the question and I can read it out. And just while people are gathering their thoughts, I might take the chair's privilege to ask a quick one. Alex, I'm incredibly enthusiastic about your call to think about colonial and decolonial relations beyond the binary of colonizer versus colonized. And just coming back to the starting point of your talk, I was wondering about how the special issue might have changed the way you conceptualize the category of independence. Or, related terms, autonomy, things like that.
So, one of the things that was in the deep sort of background for me, because I read quite a lot of philosophy and political philosophy when I was an undergraduate, and it's something I've always been interested in. There we go. One of the things that I always struck me as sort of ironic or strange was that contemporary political philosophy has had an Arendtian turn recently, or it's had, which is sort of part of a broader sense in academy that human beings are porous, interconnected, not autonomous, sealed off from each other. So there's been a lot of work in political philosophy about what is freedom in a world in which human beings are not autonomous individuals? How can we understand solidarity in a situation where, we are all connected to each other in some sense, causally and affectually, rather than by choice? And at the same time that this weakening and problematizing of autonomy and independence is going on in political philosophy, both at the level of the individual and the nation state or the political community, there's been a huge rise in discourses of autonomy and individuality and independence in leftist discourses in the academy, at least in the US. I think first about the many, like in Hawaii, Hawaiian nationalism is one longstanding sort of leftist political project connected to indigenous autonomy and resurgence. And this whole thing in this rethinking decolonization issue is about the problems with the nation state, many people who are involved in indigenous thought that I know of, and I'm hardly an expert, often contrast those older nationalist projects with a new anarcho-indigenous perspective, which is attempting to think relationality past the nation state, something like that. But you also had, in terms of the decolonization, especially in America, books like Decolonizing Anthropology by Harrison had a huge surge of interest. And if you read her introduction to that volume, which is great, the volume is great. The paper on cargo cults in there is actually very strong. At times she kind of sounds like Thomas Jefferson, autonomy, individuality, freedom. And that's fine. That part of Thomas Jefferson I like a lot, not the other parts necessarily. I think David French said Thomas Jefferson had a good highlight reel. That's a funny joke for Americans. So I was struck sort of trying to bring these two trends together. On the one hand, a renewed interest in nationalism, autonomy, indigenous communities having a resurgence. But then on the other hand, all of this literature on nationalism and its limits and the fact that actually during the decolonization period and even earlier, there are all these other non-state projects going on. So my sense to answer your question, my sense was that when we rethink decolonization, it's to try to bring that broader perspective to bear on everything, not just Papua New Guinea, but also some of these other issues that we're trying to understand and decide today. So if you've read any Jamaica Osorio, she's a very popular author here in Hawaii now, I think she's had an influence on me when I think about the alternatives to nationhood and other ways we might build community, which, I say that in full knowledge, not having spent very much time with her personally. I suspect she thinks I should just get off the island, but there you are.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. So we've got a question from Inga.
Yeah, hi, Alex. Very interesting. I'm particularly interested in the issue of people returning to tribal fighting, partly because I work among the Kalam who didn't. And it said there, there was this thing of stop fighting and we'll give you development. And then when it was clear that development of the kind they were anticipating wasn't happening, there's the return to fighting. But I don't really believe that fighting and development are traditionally binaries. So, like if you say the reason they went back to fighting is they didn't get development, it sounds a bit petty, whereas I suspect there are much deeper other reasons why that failure and other factors led to the return to tribal fighting. And I'd be really interested in your view of what were the various factors that meant that Enga returned to tribal fighting in that fairly early period.
Yes, thank you for that. You raise very good points. And I try not to be petty. The article is longer than the Enga returned to fighting after they didn't get development. So, but I don't know just because it's longer if it's avoided that potential criticism. I think that the first, oh boy, there's a lot there. The first thing to say is it's not clear that what happened in the 80s could be characterized as tribal fighting. Right? There were new forms of conflict, and they were, as if you read the first paper that I did on this, they were often tied to provincial government. So what happened in the 80s was whoever was the governor basically had access to all of the resources that were flowing into the country. And I make an argument in this paper about the nature of taxation in PNG. Taxes are gathered in the center and spent in the periphery. So there's a long history of people in Enga and other places expecting services, but not expecting to be taxed, which is very different from the United States, where taxpayers' rights is central, and I imagine it's similar in Australia as well. Yeah. So there was political contestation over who could be the district administrator and who was going to be the member, because whoever that was, their tribes would have access to the wealth that was flowing in from the center. Yeah. And then that became more and more violent. is the short version. Yeah.
That's very interesting, because in doing my comparative stuff from the Kalam, the one reason I found about Kalam is that they did not allow development activities, whether councils or later politics, to actually affect their hierarchy of big men. So that they didn't face that issue that you're just mentioning, where people have manipulated their role in development to power that then had to be fought. And I think that may be a factor in them not returning to fighting. But I'm still working on it.
Yeah, well, let me know what you figure out.
Very interested to communicate with you as it goes, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this issue of, and again, I study Porgera, which is a bit different, but people talk a lot about amongos or kamonk. The ideal person was a wealthy person. And there still is an agonistic egalitarianism in which wealthy people who have control of resources compete for preeminence, and it leads to a lot of competition. In Hagen, somehow people get these groups together that are big enough, they start businesses and they seem to be more solidary. I think Joe Catan kind of documents this a little bit, but in Enga, well, who knows what's going on in Enga right now. But
right now, it's very worrying, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a relationship between politics there. But so I'd love to talk with you, and it'd be very interesting to see.
Thank you.
I think we have Helen. Helen, you have another one?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks, Alex, for the special issue. It's just great to see this stuff coming out on PNG in this, this important year, and I've been reading it with much interest, and I kind of get the same sense that you guys are struggling with elements of PNG independence that I have actually probably since I started to think about it. And you were very kind saying that I'd written about it, but in fact I hadn't. I'd just been thinking about it for a long time, which was, how it didn't seem to follow the traditional trajectory of anti-colonialism, except for some, once you've got the university, then you've got a kind of more standard global anti-colonial discourse happening. You've got the Waigani seminars happening. But as Kai Malagima says in our special issue for the Australian Historical Studies, I think he's coming from a Papua Basina perspective to some extent. He said it's the elites. The people were never brought along. Now, that's actually not entirely true, according to another author in our special issue, Dr Limpeteke's comment. But there is, I think, historically through all the documents, quite significant resistance to independence, or certainly the speed of independence. Courtney Handman's wonderful article on the United Nations and the visiting missions I thought it's fascinating. In the 1960s, you start to see people pushing back and saying, we don't want the UN telling us what to do. And Brad and I have been reading the House of Assembly debates from about 1972 to up until independence. You've got the same arguments. We don't want the UN telling us what to do. It's up to us. We were told that it would be our choice when independence is going to happen. I mean, you've got Pangu Party pushing, but you've got you've got the United Party pushing back fairly strongly. And the High Commissioner from Australia at the time after self-government, before independence, acknowledged that if there was a referendum within those years about independence, it would have lost, that Papua New Guineans would not have wanted to become independent. And I'm kind of fascinated by that because, as you know, we know that Australians were harsh, nasty colonists in many instances. But I wonder, and this comes back to the Papua Basina thing and Kaimalagima's argument, it was up to Australians to change and become better people as far as Papua New Guineans were concerned. They didn't need to become independent. They wanted Australians to be better and to treat them properly. I don't know. I find it fascinating, and I just wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, well, first I should say, I regret, I will throw it into the chat, the special issue that Helen and Brad did, which I think must have gone through at the exact same time as ours.
I think so, yeah.
So they're very much, I think, twins. I think we're, so it's wonderful to see people working on this, and thanks for that. Thanks for that quote about Courtney. She's not here, but I just love her stuff so much. I think it's so good, and it's written with such a kind of a gimlet eye. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I think, one of the reasons we were inspired to do this that I forgot to mention earlier was that if you just take even a close look at the history of the independence era, you can see this is not Algeria in the 1950s. This is by the time PNG became independent in 75, there was a narrative about how nations were supposed to become independent. And the Australians definitely were encouraging Papua New Guineans to live out that narrative. And it could be it could be difficult to find people who are willing to do that. And that can be a hard message to hear for people who are expecting all Black people to be upset at white colonizers. So that trying to convey some of that complexity, which we always knew was out there, was important. And it is, the more, as you're right, the more you dig into it, the more and more complex it is. So you get situations, just as you've said, where people say, if autonomy is letting us decide what we want, then what we want is not formal autonomy. Yeah. And as I said earlier at this paper, the model was free services from Australia. Schools, roads, and hospitals were just supposed to be built for Papua New Guineans. I mean, who doesn't like that? I'd take that, tax-free development. So I think, maybe one of the things to think of in the future, or maybe it's already been said about in your paper, is to think about tracking down some more of those resistances. And also, I think there's a broader, I didn't want to get too much into the psychodrama of it here, but the sort of broader psychodrama of how we can have a moral relationship to a European, the classical question, and who Australians needed Papua New Guineans to think they were, so that Australians could be the kind of people they were. What kind of people Papua New Guineans fantasize a developer would be, what kind of person they want to come and bring free goods and money. As someone who has been cast in that role many times, including the last time I was in PNG a couple of months ago, I have a strong sense in which, you become an object of fascination and people want you to come and bring wealth in a certain way and not others. So there is a kind of, there's a sort of almost more psychoanalytic dimension you could pursue too. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right, so our next question is from Ryan.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for this presentation. It's a great issue. I really enjoyed all of the papers. Well, I should be honest here. I really enjoyed the papers that I read, and I'm looking forward to reading the other papers at the earliest opportunity. But
they're even better, mate. They're even better.
Yeah, right. So feel free to comment on whatever part of this interests you. I don't think this has really been a part of your presentation of the questions behind yours, but it's one that I couldn't help but think about. And this is just a recent bit of news about the current ongoing census, the first census in PNG for over 10 years, I think, long delayed. And as everybody in this room can probably imagine, a very difficult undertaking under any circumstances. And I suppose I'm pretty surprised. What do I know about censuses? I'm surprised by the growth of the population, but I guess I just wanted to throw this out on the table for you and other people to comment on, which is, can we think about the politics of numbers in the broader historical terms and the critical perspective that Alex is bringing to us? Because, as I'm sure everybody will be aware, it's always relative to population growth that PNG's, quote, success as an independent country is assessed. So when in the early 2000s, there were those Australian neoliberal academics who were saying failed state this, failed state that, it was implicit that, well, it failed because it didn't grow as fast as it needed to relative to its growing population. And now, with all of the controversy that surrounded the census and what it might discover, which is a very high population, I just thought it would be interesting to revisit those questions. I know that Courtney's paper talks a little bit about the unknowability of the interior. I was just wondering if you saw larger themes that are worth discussing.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Ryan. You always have such a detailed understanding of these things and are able to dig in with such particularity to them. You know, that discourse of failed state was one of the targets in my paper when I wrote it. And my basic claim was that, you know, the goal was to not have a state, or there was a fundamental ambivalence to imposing a state on people. And I had a long go on the PNG. I'm sorry if you're getting helicopter noise down here. We live near the hospital where there's the helipad for people from the other islands. Or it could just be the military. But then I ended up cutting all of that because there was no room in the paper.
A sequel then.
Yeah, sequel. I should turn it into something. Yeah, but there is this assumption that the Australians built a state, when I think that might not quite be true, partially in terms of what they actually did, and also the anthropology of the state suggests that a state is a little bit more complicated than we think. And that failed state literature, anyways, had some shortcomings. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, since Papua New Guinea's status is being developed or not depends on what percentage of people can do something. If you find extra people and they haven't been to university, suddenly it looks like the government is doing a bad job. Yeah. So one of the things we didn't do in the paper that we could have would sort of be like a Sally Ingle Mary thing, where we looked at how quantitative data was used to present a picture of the nation. And I think that would be a really fascinating paper to do, since I know many of us rely on those old annual reports, which are basically massive tabulations of data. And many of us lament the way in which those reports are no longer available. The way in which an official narrative about Papua New Guinea can be summoned by quantitative data would be really interesting to see, especially because as ethnographers, we all know when people say there's 12 million people, or, you know, this many people, or this or that, we always wonder where these figures come from. Even in America, where there's quite good quantitative social scientists, the ethnographers are like, well, what happens when you turn life into data? In PNG, where it's much harder to do a census, yeah, that's an issue as well. It's a great topic. You should do it.
Wait, you said you already wrote the paper, though.
No. I wrote the paper criticizing the failed state literature.
Yeah, that's a great paper. You should do it. I'll do something different.
I'm glad we got that figured out. So I'll do that. You do the quantitative data as a narrative arc about Papua New Guinea's development. Or if you don't want to do it, maybe someone else on the call can.
Excellent. Thank you. We're all coming away from this with, you know, different writing projects for the end of the year. I like that, you know, someone else will choose what we could write, a little gift. Our next question is from Michael.
You're muted.
Hello, Alex. You made a really crucial point at the start when you said, Ingens, so, you know, we don't like fighting, we hate fighting, please come so that we don't have to fight anymore. And of course, public safety and living in peaceful conditions is a material improvement to people's lives as much as the cargo they were desiring. And it's it's just such a miserable way to exist. And now we're seeing calls for, Australian intervention, and I'm not sure if that's essentially different from, calls for the return of colonial rule in many ways. So I was just sort of wondering what you think of the role of the desire for public safety and that kind of fundamental public safety role of ideally of police and soldiers and what have you.
Yeah. Well, as you know from the emails we've been exchanging with Polly Wiesner, getting back to Ryan's point, one of the key things about Enga that's different from what happened before is just the amount of people in it. Even just from my own 25 years of going there, it's just every place is visibly more crowded. And it's not just migration to centers, urban centers, or what counts as urban. It really is, there's been a tremendous growth of people. So situations where people get in fights that would turn destructive, that's a 1 in 1,000 chance of happening. In these higher population, low resources, people are more miserable and more desperate situations. There'll be more people fighting. I'm a contrarian about this. One of the points in my article was that, Australia never had the capacity to have regular policing in Enga, and the PNG government today still doesn't have enough police in the country. And, my paper argues that if there was more repression and more violence against Angans, it might have been good for them in the long run, because it might have spurred the creation of some kind of nationalist or collective sentiment, more bargaining with the powers that be, as we saw in medieval Europe or in other places. So the original idea of the paper, which I think the peer reviewers told me was just too flamboyantly combative, would have been, that if the Australians had been more vicious and cruel, it would have been better for Papua New Guineans, because it would have spurred the kind of desire to start a sort of nationalist project. But the other sort of flamboyantly inappropriate thing to say, I often say about Enga, this is very unpopular to say in the United States, is that, they've abolished the police there. And the result is not a sudden outbreak of people spontaneously being nice to each other. It turns out that people need structures to live in. And Michael and I have been talking about this. What do we do to try to bring some kind of public safety to Enga or Hela or Morabay or Moresby or anything like that? And there's there's a lot of options that I don't think are going to work, like a Christian revival, Yumi by Come Up One Bell, Lewa Bulamipula by Pure, that kind of stuff, relying on enthusiasm, although very popular for Christians, I think is not really going to do the job. Repression, straight up repression, will not do the job. I think Michael and I differ. I'm very skeptical about grassroots non-state movements to establish peace, alternative justice resolutions. I don't see those as being successful, having a long track record of success. I mean, I feel like Enga just needs the amount of policemen that every place in the world has, and there's a huge amount of unemployed people, and there's a huge amount of jobs to do. And I think that's what the province needs. And you can't just have police, the province needs schools, it needs business opportunities. It just needs more governance, not less or a different kind, I think. Yeah, so I often think about, because I have, sort of Hanai members of my family there, people in Papua New Guinea who are my kids' age, who I'm very close to. I think, what would I want for my kids if they lived in Enga? I would want 911, there is an Australian version of 911. It's triple zero. It's like 911, but with beetroot on it or something like that. And I'd want them to have schools that work, highly, incorruptible politicians, public works. I just think they just need regular, straight up government. I think that's the solution. It's also not likely to happen. That doesn't mean that that's not the solution. So, yeah.
Excellent. So there's time for another question if anyone would like to get a last one in.
We have.
If
Can
not,
I
there
ask
was.
a very quick question of Alex? Which country would you point me to that has regular, straight-up government that we could possibly use as a model today?
Well, I've always been so impressed by the Australians, or
Eh,
at
you
least
don't
I
live here,
used
so
to
you
be.
don't know what really goes on, Alex.
Well, you say that, but you don't have cops, killing people,
You
strangling
do
them,
if
and
you're a
shooting them in
black
the street.
person. You do if you're a black person in Australia. There are many cop shootings of Aboriginal people, I assure you,
I
today.
think that that is fair. I think that that is fair. But well, you know what? I'll tell you what, Inga. Let's have this talk again in a week.
We will.
We'll
Okay.
see what happens with elections.
Oh,
But
well,
I
there's
think,
that. There's that. Yes.
yeah, that's that. We'll have to see. I think we
Good
might have the
luck.
better of you, or you might have the better of us after that. I
We'll
think
just
that.
follow in your footsteps if you go down the chute.
Yeah, that's right.
Trouble.
We'll see. But I do think that. I do think that we have it. I guess I would want for Papua New Guineans what wealthy white Americans have. Yeah. And I recognize that America is not a place where everyone has those opportunities. Maybe Norway, Sweden, someplace where,
Yeah.
they don't have to deal with the problem of difference or poverty. Yeah.
All right, just to wrap us up, there's been a nice comment from Ryan in the chat, but we're going to move along to a question from Jenny.
Thanks. I'm here. I'm putting on all the
Hey, Jenny.
equipment. Hello, good to see you and many of you. Thanks for doing this chat, Alex. I think, yeah, so, well, firstly, I was just going to say I have a PhD student, a woman from Enga, who I've worked with closely probably for nearly 6 years because she had a COVID interruption for a while. And I think she would agree with everything that you've said about Enga. And it's been really interesting to try to sometimes have conversations about what's happening in the literature around the ways that people are writing about culture and decolonization when she feels strongly that culture is like a big problem in her everyday family existence in Enga and so forth. But so my question was actually, though, I think early on in the intro you said, of course, that you've been going to Enga for a long time, but you hadn't done this kind of paper, wasn't based on being in Enga per se, and partly because of the conflict and violence and difficulties and so forth, I think. So I guess I was just wondering how the topic, might have come out differently if it was one that you did in a field work way, or drawing on your long historical, ethnographic work in the place, I guess, how it might have unfolded a little bit differently. Not a critique of the methods you did use, it's just more a curious thing, especially as we are thinking always in anthropology about the different ways of going about doing this kind of work. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. There was a report called the Enga Law and Order Project report, which was done in the 80s on tribal fighting, which is very hard to find. And one of the things that it found was that traditional culture was a cause of violence, and that we should be skeptical about the idea, then very common in the 80s, that if we just returned to our culture, fighting would stop. And I feel, God, I saw somewhere a letter from like the secretary of Enga province from 1982 when this report came out that said, who does this fellow think he is? If he publishes that, I'm going to find him and kill him. So there's always that thread in this, that culture is the problem, not the solution. And the idea that it's one or the other is something that I also need to think is problematized. But the reason that I did that historical work was because all these things were happening and I just had no idea why, and I didn't have any historical background. So I felt like the historical work had to be done not only because I couldn't do ethnography, but it had to be done before the ethnography. Yeah. And doing the ethnography is going to be very difficult. Tacitus, the Roman historian, only studied dead emperors because he said it was too dangerous to do a history of the living emperors. And I think that's true about politics today. Trying to do an ethnography of police or tribal fighting is very, very fraught. And I'm gonna, in January, start thinking about a research visa, but you're quite limited in what you can do, right? And in what kind of, I mentioned that I have kids earlier. What kind of field work can you do when your body is not your own and your life is not your own? You have obligations to people. Something that some of us are thinking increasingly of now, Tom. So we'll see. I think I'm going to still rely a lot on police reports. My own experience trying to track down what happened to Apalaka, the village where I lived when it was burned to the ground, was very scary and involved dealing with a lot of people. So who had a lot of feels and automatic weapons. So I'll let you know, I guess would be my answer.
Thanks. No, it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Excellent. So on that note, we can wrap up. All that's left for me to do is to thank Alex for his excellent presentation and also to thank all of you for the great discussion.
Thank you.
Before we leave, I want to end with just a little product placement. I just want to mention that the upcoming issue of Oceania, which should be published in the next month, also contains some papers that speak to the theme that Alex and Courtney have raised about rethinking decolonisation. There's a great paper by Eric Hirsch entitled Critique, Vision and Cosmology, Millenarian Ideas in Melanesia, which examines the relationship between cargo cults and critique. And also two papers that speak very much to Alex's solo paper, looking at the politics of aspiration in West Papua, Becoming Stronger, Christianity and Indigenous Politics of Self-Determination and Endogenous Transformation by Cypri Dale, and Becoming Somebody for Married Young People, Papua, Indonesia by Lintang Sudabayo and Lynn Parker. So thank you.
Thank you. I just have one more thing I forgot to mention. Unfortunately, and despite my reasoned objections to the contrary, Nayahamui Rooney, whose paper was not included in this special issue. So one of my disappointments with this special issue was that the Papua New Guinean on it was not able to present. I had a discussion with Oceania. They made a principled decision that they did not feel her paper was up to snuff, I suppose you could say. But she has posted it at ResearchGate. So please go ahead and take a look at that. It is available, and it's about how Manus is a place where people's imagination of Australia being a friend or enemy, a colonizer or colonized by Australian foreigners is mooted. So I just have to give a shout out to her. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Every special issue has a sort of director's cut in the editor's minds of the papers that fell out along the way.
That's right.
So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Cheers. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time.